Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today you join us for another exciting episode with a special guest, but also a recurring guest on the podcast.
Yeah, Happy New Year, everyone. Good to see you again. And today we are joined by Daniel, again, our good friend. We've spoken previous foreign policy issues such as the Israeli sort of buffer zone in Syria, Bashar al-Assad's fall, many more things, including British politics. But now, today we set our sights on Venezuela and for the latest developments that have happened as a result of the US invasion and capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife. Daniel, it's good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Dan and John.
So to kick it off, Daniel, it's been fairly hard to miss it on the news. It's dominated social media and the traditional media, and that's Trump's invasion of Venezuela, capturing Nicolas Maduro. So for our listeners, can you perhaps explain what has gone on in the last few days?
Of course, I think the first thing to mention is, who is Nicolas Maduro? So he was the communist dictator of Venezuela for the last 13 years, and he'd been involved in all kinds of human rights abuses. That being said, Trump's basically levied these accusations that Maduro was this narco-terrorist and involved in sending these narco boats and drugs to the United States. So his response in recent months has been to build up US military forces in the Caribbean, and then that's ultimately culminated a few days ago with the US Delta Force, which is the Army's special forces. They went in around 2 a.m. to Maduro's palace, and they essentially literally abducted him from his home, killing a number of his guards in truly an extraordinary operation, and they've taken him back to the United States to be tried in a New York court. So it's all quite extraordinary.
This afternoon.
John. Yeah, exactly.
Also, I just wanted to add, Nicolas Maduro started out sort of political career when he was in high school. He was the president of his sort of high school. And then he became a bus driver. Because he didn't finish high school, he became a bus driver and then a trade unionist, a trade union leader like his father. Got very close to Hugo Chavez and sort of became Hugo Chavez's sort of adopted son. And in the process, he also married his current wife, which was Hugo Chavez's lawyer. So
Who has also been
Maduro,
taken.
who's also been taken, exactly.
Yeah.
So Maduro's sort of platform of getting elected initially was this continuation of Hugo Chavez's policies and being his successor. And now we see Maduro, after some very dodgy elections 2 summers ago, where we're not quite sure what the result was. Maduro and the official government claims they narrowly won. So parallel counts by the opposition party claim a very big loss for him. So it's a very tough situation to deal with. We're not really sure what he's doing. We're not sure what he's capable of. And I think that's partly the reason why Maduro has been so successful in keeping power and so successful in managing Venezuela for his own good, not for the good of anyone else, but for his own good, because so many people underestimated him in the last 15 years.
And I think it's an interesting idea, that, Diane, of how Maduro has managed Venezuela, because now that Trump's removed Venezuela, I think it's been revealed of how it's almost formed Venezuela of these rival gangs, sectarian groups, different sects across society, effectively have made lots of money from drug trafficking. And that seems to be the real challenge for Trump if he wants to manage Venezuela. So perhaps, Daniel, again, what are these big challenges that Trump will face governing a country like Venezuela?
I mean, absolutely huge challenges. I mean, frankly, we're sort of used to when the United States president says something that we actually take that seriously. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that a lot of what Trump says is literally on the spot, not having told anyone else about it and not actually intending to act on it. I think a lot of it is mostly just an act, essentially. So I don't think Trump is actually intending to invade Venezuela, most likely, because I don't think he can really stomach a invasion, because that's what he'd have to do. He'd have to invade, because all he's done is just sort of cut the head off the snake, if you like. But the entire kind of regime of Maduro, which has been built up over Chavez and Maduro, is still very much intact. And they're not just going to simply hand over without a fight. So I think that's the first big challenge. How does Trump actually rule Venezuela? And then I suppose another one is, can he manage to get some kind of deal? I think that's possibly what he's trying to get a deal with the sort of acting president of Venezuela. And if he can make a deal with her to get some oil out of Venezuela, which is probably one of the real reasons why he's gone for this, then I think that's probably the best he can get.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. I think Trump trying to manage Venezuela and govern it would be disastrous. It would be a disaster for Venezuela. And a clear sort of comparison that you could form is when the US invaded Iran in 2003. And then coalition provisional authority there was an absolute disaster. It actually made the situation there arguably worse. It led to having to place more US troops in Iran because they just simply couldn't manage the situation there. And Venezuela will be even harder. In Iran, they had 150,000 troops on the ground. They've got none in Venezuela at the moment, so they wouldn't be able to deal with all these issues of gang violence. Also, Venezuela is actually a very large country. Sort of following on from that Iran comparison, it's twice the size of Iran. It's actually even bigger than countries like Turkey. So it would be, to govern it, extremely difficult. More problematically for Trump as well, Trump's got no plan whatsoever when it comes to how to govern it. I think it was a CNN reporter asked him yesterday, so how are you going to do it, Donald? How are you going to govern Venezuela? And he just waffled, as he usually does, said a few words. And I think it became apparent that him and Marco Rubio have really not thought beyond what to do. It's like you said there, Daniel, you don't really know whether to take him seriously in many ways.
Yeah, I think another important aspect of it is to say that Maduro has managed Venezuela very poorly as a nation. He's not been able to extract any of the natural resources, oil, gold, other precious minerals. He just hasn't been able to do it. He also hasn't been able to manage his population in a way that they are sort of growing in wealth, growing in GDP, and overall just a very poor management of the whole country. But that is to say that Maduro and his regime have been very good in managing themselves and their own sort of finances. So I think it is quite likely that the acting president now, Maduro's vice president, would take a deal because, the way it's worked with Maduro is you do what's best for yourself and hope it works. It could happen. We've seen statements that the sort of opposition leader, the one that received the Nobel Prize, Maria Machado, is not considered by Trump as fit to lead. Doesn't have the respect and authority or something like that. Anyway, there's basically very little sort of power, actually, I'd say. Apart from Maduro's regime, Trump doesn't really seem interested in talking to anyone. So it will be interesting to see how he manages that situation. But I want to ask you, Daniel, as well. What are some of the winners and losers of this situation?
Well, I mean, I guess the biggest loser on the face of it would be Maduro. He seems to have been taken completely by surprise. I think he probably thought that the US would continue striking these narco boats as they had been doing and maybe ramping up pressure a little bit. But I don't think he really predicted, and I don't think anyone actually predicted, despite what they may now say, that an abduction of Nicolas Maduro was at all on the table. So I think Maduro is the biggest loser. Biggest winner is potentially Trump, potentially Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, because they've masterminded this operation, and it certainly looks good for a lot of Trump's base. That being said, this may turn out to be a long, drawn-out foreign intervention, which won't play well with a lot of the America First people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's already said that she doesn't approve of it. And in that sense, I think maybe this situation may not really have any winners at all in the very long term. You mentioned the opposition leader, Machado.
Yeah.
I think she's finished as well, frankly. I don't think she's going to get anything out of it because I don't think... Well, number one, Trump's annoyed that she won the Nobel Peace Prize instead of him. So there's a personal reason why he disapproves of her. And then the second reason is that he knows that she wouldn't give him unlimited access to the oil reserves and gold reserves of Venezuela, which is the kind of commercial interest in taking Venezuela in the first place. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's gone after Venezuela when he could have, let's say, gone against Colombia, the president of which he has said is also a cocaine dealer. So why choose Venezuela over Colombia? Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that, they've got the largest untapped oil and gold reserves in the world. So I'd say it's definitely a reason.
And I agree with that. This phrase has become very popular since Trump abducted Maduro, and that is oil imperialism. Trump has almost sort of reinvigorated this idea of neocolonialism by his abduction of Maduro, because he's got this commercial interest. And so, as I'm sure our listeners know, but Venezuela has the most amount of oil of any nation in the world. It's 303 billion barrels. So that's more than Saudi Arabia. However, it's effectively, this oil's just not actually really being accessed. It's not really being treated or extracted. There lacks the infrastructure to do it at the moment. So there's a real commercial gain that could be achieved, as you said there, Daniel, from accessing this Venezuelan oil, which would be incredibly lucrative for Trump. And I think that makes him, in a way, a winner. There's a commercial aspect to Maduro. There's lots of countries around the world which have worrying dictators. You mentioned that Colombia. But at the end of the day, Venezuela will always be interesting. And another point similar to that is that Venezuela has the opportunity to be extremely economically successful. And that is proven by Guyana, which is, I think, perhaps neighboring Venezuela, or it's definitely in that same part of Northeast South America. And Guyana is currently the fastest growing country in Latin America. And that's because they discovered a lot of oil there. And since then, they've had extraordinary economic growth. And it seems to be proving very well for Guyana. I think, unfortunately, with Venezuela, its economic impact on the Venezuelan people may not be too large. However, Trump will be happy, I'm sure, as the one on the receiving end of all this money.
Yeah, I think also just to sort of canvas everything, I think the biggest winner actually is US oil, is big oil.
Yeah.
They're going to make so much money out of this one way or another. So I think, but I actually don't think Trump is a winner at all. I think all that Trump is hearing is sort of international law violation, people putting pressure on him. We've seen Zelensky put pressure on him yesterday saying, oh, is this what you think of dictators? You know what to do next. Sort of, he gets all this sort of pressure and the legal aspect of it. I think Marco Rubio for me is the biggest winner here, because he can have a claim of having sort of conducted, planned, and executed this operation. He can also make this one of his points in his CV when he prepares for the next primary state with a very successful mission. But I also don't think Rubio's done. I don't think he's done. I think Cuba might be next.
Yeah.
I think Colombia might be next, although, Colombia doesn't have a dictator, but Trump seems to claim that Petros is a cocaine dealer. Maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. I don't know. I find it hard to believe, but, is what it is.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Rubio doesn't seem to be done. It seems like, to me, he's preparing his sort of CV to counterbalance what he lacked in the previous runs he made, which people just didn't think he was tough enough, didn't have this sort of killer instinct that Trump had. And now I think he's trying to prove people wrong. If he's got 3 successful operations and I were JD Vance, I would not like it, because 3 successful operations for Marco Rubio, to me, equals him winning the Republican nomination.
Oh, Diane, you mentioned that idea of an international precedent, and I think there's one that Rubio wants even more, and that's Greenland. So, Daniel, can you explain to us what is the situation with Greenland and Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose Greenland and Venezuela might seem fairly unrelated, being in totally different parts of the world. But then again, they're actually quite similar, because Venezuela and Greenland both have these untapped mineral resources. And Trump, being very commercially minded, wants to get this real estate that he calls it. And, at first he proposed to purchase Greenland And now he said, his inauguration address even, he said, the United States will be taking Greenland. I mean, that brings up a whole load of issues, namely that Greenland is a sort of protectorate of Denmark, which is part of NATO, which America is in turn meant to lead. So who will actually come to the aid of Greenland if the United States were to move in? It would be very easy. I mean, they've already got military bases in Greenland as is, supposedly for the defense of Greenland, but which now can be used as a base to take over the island. So, but do I actually think, this is a credible assertion from Trump? Probably not. I don't think he's going to just suddenly move in and take Greenland. That being said, if you'd asked me a few days ago whether I thought he would kidnap Maduro, I would probably say no. So he's clearly much more ambitious than he was in his first term. There's this idea of Trump 2.0, where he's just willing to basically do whatever he wants because he knows he's not up for re-election. So he doesn't really have many consequences. He's more or less shirked all of the judicial and legal proceedings are against him, and it more or less seems that he's untouchable, except with the one issue of the Epstein files, which he's now successfully distracted the world from with his sort of foreign policy kind of bravado in Venezuela, probably in Greenland, maybe in Panama, which he's also expressed interest in. So I think, with regard to Greenland, I think it's possible that Trump would move in there, but I don't really see it as being that likely, to be honest.
Yeah, I fully agree with you, Daniel. I think if we're looking at who actually runs these operations, it's not Trump, it's Marco Rubio. And I think Marco Rubio's main aim is Cuba for a personal reason. It's Cuba and Latin America for a personal reason. I think that's going to be where the focus is. I think Greenland doesn't help anyone. We need to remember that Marco Rubio and Trump used to call each other names only a couple years ago. We need to forget this appearance that they are best friends and they are looking out for one another. They're both very selfish and very sort of only looking at their own self-interest. Marco Rubio has no interest in getting people upset internationally and having Europe and other parts of NATO get upset at the US and force an international scandal. He doesn't want that. What he wants, though, is to gain more support of his base, and that is going into Cuba, that is going into Colombia, going into Panama, and sort of making the claim that he's cleaning these countries up, more so getting the vote of the Hispanics. So, I just don't see Greenland as a possibility. John?
I would slightly disagree. I mean, I think firstly, it's all fairly astonishing that Trump wants to be sort of colonial power, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He views the USA as this sort of imperial force, which is totally bizarre in any way. But I think Greenland's unlikely, and I think it would just have this awful international reaction. But I think in a way it could be more likely than some of the Latin American countries. And that's because there's a big detachment from what Marco Rubio wants and perhaps what Trump wants. Trump has constantly gone on about Greenland for so long. He's always had it as this sort of slightly bizarre ambition of his. And Greenland is extremely valuable. And following on from what Daniel said in its commercial sense, it's got all these mineral resources. Strategically as well, Trump's very bothered about China and Russia. And Greenland, with its access to the Arctic Circle, would be, that's why the US military base is there currently, because it's strategically important. I think perhaps the part of this Greenland discussion, though, has been slightly invigorated by Katie Miller, who is the wife of Mr. Trump's deputy chief of staff, Stephen Miller. And so on social media, she has posted a map of Greenland painted in the US flag with the caption "soon" underneath it. I mean, I don't think this is likely. I think she's perhaps got a bit too caught up in all the drama about what's going on in Venezuela.
Yeah.
But I think Trump will always go on about Greenland because at the end of the day, it's strategically useful. And he seems to get slightly obsessed about things and about his international image.
Yeah, I think, that's I think, I've just seen Trump sort of yesterday evening for them. So this morning for us, I've made a statement that we need Greenland for national security reasons. I don't think we will come to an invasion. I think, I think the sort of Europe is too smart to allow an invasion. And maybe what would happen is sort of Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz and even Keir Starmer going to the sort of leader of Greenland, the president of Greenland, saying, look, you got to give it up.
Yeah.
That might happen. I don't see an invasion because the moment an invasion happens, Europe's got one sort of goal, and that's not letting Russia in. That's the biggest threat. And the moment you've got another war in European soil, it's game over. Especially if it's with America. If you've got a war with Russia in the east and a war with America in the west, it's game over.
And Daniel, perhaps for our final question, what sort of precedent do you think Trump's activities will set? Is Xi Jinping now, for example, going to want Taiwan even more?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, the precedent set now is basically that, the strong eat the weak almost. It's sort of returning to 20th century kind of, even early century kind of geopolitics. I think it shows that America now is more or less a rogue state, to be honest, in that its actions can no longer be predicted based on the previously kind of accepted rules-based order idea that America will be kind of the policeman of the world. Rather, in fact, America will be looking solely for its own interests and expanding its power, literally just by seizing oil fields just because it wants to without any real attempt to give any kind of justification for that. And I think it does give permission for people like Xi Jinping to say, well, why don't I just take Taiwan? I mean, if America's taking Venezuela, which has nothing to do with America, then surely I can take Taiwan because it's part of China. Similarly, how can America realistically criticize Putin for invading Ukraine when he's just asserted dominance over Venezuela? These two things are both just, that's the precedent set, basically, is that there's not much difference between these three strongmen anymore. And I think that's what Europe's got to realize, is that with America, they're not dealing with Joe Biden or even a George Bush who can be predicted to work with Europe. Trump hates Europe. He's made that perfectly clear. He says that Europe is full of degenerates and is kind of collapsing in on itself. And I think, to be perfectly honest, I think he kind of admires Putin's strength or appearance of strength, and he hopes to replicate that himself by building his own kind of almost empire of influence in the Americas, which many of Americans have thought was their own backyard. And I think Trump wants to build that up, and I think that's what he wants to be his legacy. By America first, I think what in reality he means is not kind of isolationism, but sort of rebuilding this American kind of almost empire in a way in the Americas. And as Dayan said, Marco Rubio will use it to his benefit. JD Vance has more or less been silent on this operation, and I think that will give Marco Rubio a very nice head start in the primary. Unless, of course, this all goes pear-shaped for the United States and this all just fizzles out and America doesn't take Venezuela. So we'll have to see.
Which is why JD might be keeping silent.
Exactly. If JD's thinking in the long term, he might be thinking this is going to be a disaster. And he could very well be right. Because, of course, how are US oil companies actually going to manage these oil fields when they've got communist guerrillas bombing the shipments and the trucks, in the jungle? It's just not going to work, is it, realistically?
It's almost ungovernable in a way for Trump.
Totally, yeah.
I think, and also I think, looking at what Europe's doing, I've said this before and sort of a couple of people were upset, but I think to me it's really clear that the leader of Europe at the moment is Emmanuel Macron. I don't think I don't think Keir Starmer, I don't think Friedrich Merz, I don't think anyone has had the sort of international presence that Emmanuel Macron has had, especially when it comes to Putin and Zelensky and managing the sort of Russia-Ukraine conflict. And France has been sending very mixed messages. So Emmanuel Macron sent a very vague message sort of saying that the people of Venezuela are now finally free, whilst another top government official sort of deemed the invasion as illegal under international law. So it's very clear that they're trying to play both sides. They're trying to keep Trump happy. And they're trying to sort of not lose the goal, which is keeping him not necessarily close, but not as a threat until they can deal with Putin and with the Russia-Ukraine conflict first. And it is very difficult because at this moment, Putin has got a carte blanche. He can do whatever he wants. Because no one can criticize him anymore.
So, Diane, though, discussing this idea of, who the leader of Europe is, there could be one person not European, though, that is the leader, and that is Trump, potentially. Because at the end of the day, I mean, Macron may be sort of humming and ahhing about it, but I think if any other power did what Trump did, invaded a rival country and adopted the leader, there would be so much backlash. But it's rather hesitant, isn't it, from all these European powers? And I think...
Yeah, but I think
through this relationship in a way.
Can you imagine if can you imagine Netanyahu abducting the president of Egypt? That outcry would be just absolutely extraordinary, and that's another supposed ally of Europe. So I think Trump's just totally using his status as being the leader, the biggest leader, basically, with the most power, because Europe has chained itself to America now. In a sense. I think it's not necessarily that Trump's the leader of Europe. I think Europe realizes that without Trump, they've got a very tough battle on the Eastern Front. And without keeping Trump, they might find themselves having two battles, one in the East and one in the West. And, we all know from history how having two battles, one in the East and one in the West, goes.
Yeah.
You can be whoever you want and you're probably going to lose. And they are playing this game. It's a very strategic game, I think, of, someone from the government says, oh, well done, Trump. Someone else says, oh, this is illegal. So they keep appearances. It's very interesting how they're going to play the game in the next couple of days. Emmanuel Macron has restated as well that France is going to have a role in Venezuela and that they're going to bring democracy there. I mean, are they? Probably not. But again, we need to keep in mind that we've got the far right everywhere in Europe knocking on our door. And even these presidents are trying to keep their own power and their own appearance for their own home constituents as well. It's not just an international game we're playing anymore.
And with that, I think we can conclude the episode. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. We've had some great analysis from Daniel, as per usual. And if you are listening, please do like, subscribe, comment, follow us, rate us 5-star, and all the other things you can do to promote us. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, and see you next week.